Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of AWS for Games Partner Profiles. My name is Chris Melissinos, and I'm the Principal Evangelist for Video Games here at AWS. And on today's program, we have Nev Spiteri, the CEO and co-founder of Wevr, a company that enables game developers to build their game studio in the cloud and work in a global game development environment. So let's jump on over and meet Nev and talk about Wevr. Nev, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here.
Awesome. All right, so tell us real quickly, what is Wevr?
Wevr is a software company. We've built several real-time 3D games, virtual worlds, and applications over the years using game engines like Unreal and Unity. And over the last 2 years, we've really focused the company on building the Wevr Virtual Studio platform.
Okay, so when we talk about virtual studios, right, like game developers, when we think about cloud services, we think about storage, we think about elastic compute, we think about databases, we think about, everything from authentication to live ops. But as we're looking at, working in this globally distributed development environment, and we talk about a studio in the cloud, what does that mean exactly?
Great question. So Wevr Virtual Studio is really a cloud platform that is purpose designed and built for teams, distributed teams, that are using game engines to develop real-time 3D applications and games and worlds. And it's designed to provide collaboration for these distributed team members. And by team members, I mean, the engineers, the artists, the designers, the producers, all of the stakeholders that are involved in building these 3D games and worlds. And also providing all of the out-of-the-box infrastructure that you need to support the various services in your studio. It turns out you need more than just the game engine, of course, to be able to do things like organize your assets, manage version control, do some asset validation, take advantage of the cloud and the AWS compute infrastructure very easily by being able to kick off builds in the cloud, renders, testing frameworks, and a whole variety of other compute processes. And we make all of that really easy for you to do.
Okay, so this is different than just hosting, let's say, a Windows session on a server and putting your game engine up there. We're not talking about remote desktop. You're really talking about all of the things that a modern game developer needs to go ahead and create their game, to do code check-ins, to manage those assets, to manage permissions, to give access to tools, to basically a distributed workforce. Is that correct?
That's right. And I'll show you a little bit more what I mean. It's a really cool concept that actually builds on the last 15 years of DevOps and all of the practices that have been developed in the gaming world and outside of the gaming world. So let's take a quick look. So what's involved in actually setting up a dev studio or a game studio? Well, it starts, of course, with the people that are involved, right? You've got the various personas that are involved. And nowadays, you probably also have some Gen AI as part of your team member that is going to be part of your development process. You then start to think about, right, well, you're probably going to use a game engine of some sort. So you pick whichever engine that you want to use to build your game or your experience. Then you're probably considering what are your targets? How are you going to reach your players or your audience? What specific platforms are you going to be building for? And then it's really about like, okay, where is everybody at distributed? Are they using local machines and computers, or are they using infrastructure in the cloud? And it's usually a hybrid of both, where a lot of devs like to have their local CPU and GPU and their local PC accessible to them. But you also want to be able to take advantage of all of the cloud infrastructure. If you want to use certainly a virtual machine, you can also use that with WVS. But we're really contemplating the fact that most teams really think about a hybrid solution. And the day-to-day process really of building your game or application is iterating on these inputs, which are usually code and assets that you're using various tools for, et cetera, to build and iterate on your game. And then there are, of course, all of the outputs, which are the artifacts that the team is producing, which is typically the core of that is actually the build itself, right? The core application and executable, which is the sum total of all of the inputs. But you may also be generating other outputs like renders and tests and a whole variety of things. And so that's really where the concept of Wevr Virtual Studio comes in. It's a SaaS platform that allows teams to accelerate the iteration process on a day-to-day basis as you go through building and iterating on your game and playtesting it and getting feedback and going forward there.
Amazing. I also love the fact you have the open 3D engine in there as well as one of the engines supported. So thanks very much for that. Make sure you check out the link in the description if you want to get started in open source game development, right? Building on an open source game engine, it's down there as well. So,
yeah, all right, we're engine agnostic. Yep.
Yeah, and I think that is a wonderful thing. And I think being in a cloud-enabled development environment means that sometimes you're bringing in development teams or outside resource that may be using a different development pipeline or entirely different set of tools that you may need, but you still need to leverage that expertise. So being engine agnostic allows Wevr to basically bring together those very different, possibly different, game development pipelines into a single cohesive development framework, correct?
Correct.
Very cool. Okay. So all of this sounds really, really amazing, but let's say I'm a small developer and I've never had to build something like this before. I was used to having kind of people in the office and we just, kind of use whatever we got our hands on. We're using Git to go ahead and host our code, and we're using, Discord or Slack for communication. We have a dev pipe and we would just kind of borrow tools from each other. How daunting is this for me as a small independent developer to be able to get started using a platform like Wevr?
Great. So it's, to your point, today, the existing solution is really a do-it-yourself approach where teams are constantly having to build the factory assembly line for their project, for their company, over and over again. And it usually ends up being a combination of perhaps using GitHub for storing your code. Perhaps you're using some other version control system like Perforce. You're probably having to figure out how to build your own build system or automated system using various tools that are available out there. You're certainly using some communication collaboration tool, whether it's Discord or Slack. And all of this is great. Some issue tracking system. There's a lot of services out there which work very well. And in our approach is you kind of continue to use whatever pieces make most sense for your studio. But what we've done is we've provided sort of a best-in-class version of a versioning system, for example, which is also Git-based, which works just like GitHub. It's in fact Git on the back end. And we provide a best-in-class cloud automation system so that you don't have to build one yourself. We integrate with Slack and with Discord. We integrate with ticketing systems like Jira, for example, but we also provide a ticketing system that you can use if you don't want to go out and do that. So it's very much a sort of an a la carte menu approach. And we really developed this to make it super easy for the new indie dev that is starting out to get set up right from the get-go. And our focus is making that self-service with a simple web interface, and we can take a look at how that works.
Okay, Nev, all of this sounds pretty awesome, right? The fact that I don't have to go ahead and build that entire studio by myself as a small developer who may not have an expertise in doing so. And the fact that it's also self-service and onboarding means that I can go ahead and kind of get started at my own pace. But when we talk about getting started, it's getting started with what? So we mentioned, right, the Wevr Virtual Studio. Why don't you walk us through what the Wevr Virtual Studio is and how we would go ahead and get started if we wanted to use that today?
Terrific, will do. So I'll show you. It's really cool and very easy to use. So here you can see I'm currently logged into the web interface because Virtual WVS is a SaaS platform, and all of our infrastructure is hosted on AWS. So we are taking advantage of best-in-class cloud compute, and we're a certified AWS APN partner. So we're certified for security and scalability. And we make all of that AWS power available to you very easily. So here I am logged in as myself, and these are my projects. And you can see I've got a couple of different projects here. Some are Unity projects, others are Unreal projects. And as a studio, you can be prototyping multiple projects at the same time. So it's kind of one common interface and maybe using different engines for different purposes. Let's take a look at this one example project, which is the Lyra starter game, which is an example project that ships with the Unreal Engine 5, as you all know. And as you can see here, the Lyra project is hosted on WVS, which is a Git-based version control system, all on AWS. And for those of you familiar with social coding platforms, you can see that it works very similarly. You can see your whole repository. And from the get-go, you can see what everybody is working on. So we have a very simple activity stream, so you can see everybody's check-ins. So whether you're an artist, an engineer, or a designer, wherever you're working from around the world, you've got visibility into who's doing what and what's being checked in. And it's very easy to add members and team members. So if you have a contractor that's joining your project for a brief amount of time and you want to give them access to the repository because they're going to make some animations for you, you can set those access controls very easily. Or perhaps you're sharing your build, your game with your reviewers or your publisher. You don't want to give them access to the full repo. You just want to give them access to the build artifacts. You can do that all very easily. And ultimately, the team is working together to produce outputs. So in this case, the Lyra game is both it's a multiplayer game. So both the client and the server build are automatically being kicked off and generated in the cloud on AWS. And we build both Windows and Linux. So out of the box, it's very easy to do these builds. Now, these builds are one example of the different kinds of flows. We call them flows, which are these different automations which you can develop using WVS. So what's cool about this is that these flows are written by developers, by our customers, by ourselves. So we've got some standard ones, like building, for example, an Unreal Engine game for the Quest device. Or maybe you're building a mobile game and you want to automatically deploy to test flights or to Android or to WebGL. Or perhaps you want to generate videos, or you want to export videos from Blender. These are a whole different variety of out-of-the-box templates or flows that you can just fork, just like you're forking a fragment of code. You can customize it, you can configure it, and just add it to your project, and off you go. And these flows can get quite powerful. So, for example, what are we doing with this Lyra project? I'll show you here. This is an example of a fairly complicated flow. And you can see here that the first thing we're doing is that we're automatically kicking off a runner in the cloud, which is a server that is perfectly configured exactly for the kind of thing you need to do. So we have the right Linux server or the right Windows server. You don't have to worry about setting this up yourself. Then we're seeing that it's kicking off some renders. And once the renders are done, it's dropping them into a web page. So this whole chain was set up very simply. And you can see the results by, in this case, I'm going to go and look at the page output, the web page output, where the renders have been deployed. And you can see, in this case, the artist or the engineer decided to do a simple lighting test to compare two renders. And again, you didn't have to set up all of that infrastructure. It's all available to you through this web interface. So we think that makes it really, really easy for artists and teams to work together.
Basically, by leveraging Wevr, I'm able to leverage the power of the cloud to actually do those renders and do those builds instead of trying to do them locally on my machine, which means that I get to free up the time that it may be rendering the cloud to do additional work, right? One of the problems that we've seen, right, in doing these big complex builds is that sometimes it can take local resources, tens of minutes, if not, an hour plus before you get a build back that you can work with. So Wevr basically removes that kind of blocker from your localized workflow by moving those renders, moving those builds to the cloud, correct?
Absolutely. So that's the very sort of immediate benefit. Like you're kicking off a build, you're kicking off a render. You don't want to tie up your local machine. You may not have that particular machine. So we supported a hackathon, and the devs were they were working on their PC laptop. They didn't have a Mac available to them, but they were still able to kick off Mac OS builds in the cloud. You see, and you've always heard like, hey, wait a minute, the build works on my machine, or the game runs in the editor, right? How many times have you heard that on your game team, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so by taking advantage of a standard build pipeline in the cloud, you're guaranteed, whether it's your dev build or your QA build or your production line build, it's configured to be consistent, to work, and deployable on your target device from the get-go. And so that is probably an even bigger win than the fact that your local machine is freed up, because you've set up the right practice and you're not going too far down the field and then having to backtrack your work because actually you haven't set it up in a way. And everyone on the team has access to the same consistent build for review purposes.
Yeah, I mean, you make two really great points. One is access to hardware or platforms you may not have access to within your own technology pool, right? So you can look at doing cross-platform development and deployment. That's number one. But then number two, and I think even more importantly, is making sure that you have a sanitized, centralized build that works. So because the problem is that in the attempt of doing the absolute best job, sometimes we create shortcuts for ourselves in our own build environments that, to your point, everything just worked fine here. Well, somebody else didn't have the proper version of a particular shader set or something else loaded on their render, and that's breaking on their side. It could be that 3/4 of your team have it and somebody else doesn't. So it seems to be working for everybody, but when that one person tests it, it breaks. This makes sure that everybody's working from the same build as they continue to do that development in a kind of a dispersed, remote sort of environment, correct?
That's right. And obviously this is particularly suitable for indies or startup studios. That said, we're finding that more advanced teams, right, who are already well into production, maybe they've already worked on AAA games before, you're still having to maintain all of that yourself. And it ends up being a cost and a bottleneck, even for mature studios, to maintain their own pipelines. And as you know, new versions of Unity, new versions of Unreal come out. There are multiple SDKs that you want to take advantage. So you end up having to constantly maintain that pipeline with up-to-date versions of all of the libraries and SDKs you want to use. You end up often procrastinating on that, not being able to take advantage of new versions of tools that are emerging because you're bogged down. So by taking advantage of, we take care of all of that for you, and we guarantee and ensure that you've got a best-in-class professional AAA grade pipeline that's always kept up to date, right? And that's a huge win also for larger studios and teams.
Okay. Moving on to what else does the Wevr Virtual Studio provide?
We're obviously only just sort of hitting the wave tips right now. There's a lot more sort of underlying detail. I mean, I will share a couple of things. So for example, one of the things that we do is we provide templates for teams to start with so that your project is pre-configured correctly. So for example, this notion of a locking workflow where you don't want your artists and your team members to step on each other's work. So we provide a locking mechanism in the versioning solution that we provide, which is a really nice improvement on the standard Git, because Git in and of itself, with LFS, there's some challenges around that. So we've addressed a lot of the issues that some teams have typically had with using Git. Now, Git is wonderful, right? Everybody loves the merge request, the pull request workflow. But there are some key learnings from some of the mainstays in the industry, like Perforce, which we've employed. The other thing we've done is we've also said, look, we realize that version control is something that you may be already well on your way into. Maybe you've already decided to use another version control system. So we provide bridges to your current version control system, if you like, so that you can still take advantage of the cloud automation that we provide out of the box. One of the things that we provide is an issue tracking system. So, certainly you can integrate with Jira or various other tools, but this is a full-fledged issue tracking system that we use internally for our own development. And what's nice about that is that the tickets are fully integrated with your builds, and it's just another nice little thing that we've added. You could also do things like integrate with various tools out there, such as Slack, for example, or Discord, so that when builds are completed, you get a notification for your team. So there's a bunch of nice things like that, which our customers have told us that they want, and so we've provided for them.
But now let's say, look, I'm an Unreal Engine developer, and I want to get started using Wevr today. How do I do that?
Right. So that's great, because we really are trying to think about what interface makes sense for you as a team member. So if you're using Unreal and you're in the engine and most of your day you're inside the engine in the editor, then we want to meet you right there. So we've developed a UE5.x plugin for WVS. It's a plugin that you can install and set up just like the Perforce plugin, for example. And you just select it, and you've now got a full-featured version control system that just works just like the Perforce plugin, but it's now Git on the back end and allows you to integrate directly that way. If you're an artist and you're not inside of the engine and you're spending your day in Blender or Maya, then we've provided a GUI interface for you that's really easy to use. And if you're an engineer, then you probably are familiar with Git, and you can use your favorite Git client or command line interface, etc.
Great. So the plugins that you provide then really meet all of the different team members' kind of capabilities and workflow, from a front-end GUI to a CLI. So that way people can work with Wevr and work in their game development project in the mechanism that's most comfortable for them.
That's right.
And so I'm assuming then the same workflow is available again for Unity and for Godot and right for these other engines that you're continuing to integrate and work with.
That's right. Yes, we also provide plugins for Unity, and as we support more and more engines going forward, we'll provide more capability and go deeper into those respective engines as needed and as the community asks us to.
So what I think is really cool about Wevr, right, is, as we said at the start, when people think about studio in the cloud, a lot of times they just think about the engine running someplace else other than locally. And that's not what this is about. These are all of the other pieces that need to come together to build basically a professional grade studio workflow, but not demand that you understand how to put all those pieces together. Wevr does that for you.
That's right.
So I'm building a studio, or I'm starting a new development project for a large publisher, and I want to understand what the cost of basically standing up my studio in the cloud looks like. Can you walk us through how much Wevr costs?
Absolutely, yes. Cost is actually a really, really key factor. And as a developer ourselves, having worked on projects which required 3 people, other projects which required 80 people. The per user license fees can be really challenging, and setting up your own on-prem hardware compute infrastructure is also a very big cash outlay. Cloud is also, there's a cost associated with it, but it can be used very efficiently. And so our strategy here was, as we looked at it as an indie dev ourselves, how do we make this as cost effective as possible? And so we went with a usage-based model. So essentially, you pay for what you use. So if you have a 10 gigabyte project, well, you're only paying for your 10 gigabytes of storage. If you've got a 100 gigabyte project, you're paying for that. And it's the same with compute. So if you only use, if you only do 3 builds a week and they're each 20 minutes, well, you're only paying for an hour's worth of compute. Or if you're building multiple builds a day to increase your efficiency and improve your process, then you're paying accordingly. So we've set up pricing tiers, just like most other SaaS models, where you can come in based on your team size you can find the right price, and you'll get a certain amount of compute and storage available to you. And we have a whole variety of features that are available with these different pricing plans. And then on top of that, you can buy a la carte, which is really nice because you might, for example, say, I really want to kick off this build, and I want to go super fast. So I'm gonna select a 64-core, Windows machine on the AWS infrastructure, and now I've got access to that compute. And you're paying a little bit extra for that speed, but you didn't have to go out and buy the machine yourself. And so the same is true of GPU, Mac machines, etc. So this idea of an a la carte approach, we think, is very helpful and cost effective for teams and our customers.
Yeah, that's an impressive list of services and features that somebody can get into a la carte. And I love the fact that, it also starts at a point that makes accessible to the widest audience possible and then grows with them over time, right? Really scales to meet the demand that they need and allows the flexibility of just firing up extra cores, firing up extra services just for a period of time and only paying for what they need. Very different than investing in all of that hardware and infrastructure and your own metal, instead of just leveraging those resources in the cloud on an as needed basis, right? For any specific, item or activity that your team may be trying to work through. So I think it's wonderful the way, again, Wevr sets up this very flexible way of using and paying just for what you need at the moment you need it. Very much in line with the way we at AWS think about cloud computing services as well.
We definitely took a page out of that book for sure.
And how can people go ahead and get started on their cloud game development journey with Wevr?
Super easy. You can go to wvs.io today and sign up. And you can start out with a free tier plan and start building your studio and your game today. There's documentation available as well at docs.wvs.io. And we provide a Discord channel where a lot of our early access customers are actively building their games and projects today. Please join.
That's fantastic. Nev, once again, thank you for spending time with us today, telling us about Wevr and explaining how game developers of any size can build their studio in the cloud and work in a globally distributed game development environment today.
Thank you for having me. This was really fun.